Good to have you back, ladies and gentlemen, for lesson 12a, part of unit 12. We're dealing with East Asia and the decline in China. And today we're going to really be looking at China specifically and talking about its decline and the revolution in China. Last time we talked about China, we talked about its incredible energy, huge amounts of people, lots of power. Now we're going to be looking at the decline of China as we get a little closer to the 20th century. Bit of a preview. We're going to talk a little bit about the decline of the Qing dynasty, which was the last dynasty we talked about last time we dealt with China. We're going to look at something called the Boxer Rebellion, and by boxer here we do not mean people squaring off in a ring. We're going to look at the fall of the Qing dynasty and finally civil war in China. Your reading for this particular part of the unit is going to be the Decline and Revolution in China, chapter 22, the first two sections of that chapter, and that's pages 683 to 695. In that reading, you'll come across a few terms, just three for you to be looking at. First is spheres of influence. It's not really a term, it's more of a phrase. Be looking for that. Commodity and boxer. And when you look up boxer, if you look it up in your book, you should find the right definition. If you look it up in a dictionary or online, be careful not to have the westernized version of boxer as in the sport, but you're looking at the connection with China. So let's take a look and see what happened to the Qing dynasty that led to its downfall. Last time we looked at China, it was about 1800, and the Qing dynasty was at an incredible height. The empire was very, very powerful. It was a trading market that the European nations wanted to be part of, but very quickly it declines based on a number of factors. One is pressure from the West. Lots of people from nations from the West that are trying to compete for its products. Corruption within its government. Unrest with peasants, people that were unhappy about their lot and their lives in the peasant community. Food shortages, the fact that people were starving, that always leads to unrest. And finally, extreme population growth. So with that extreme population growth, that makes the food shortages worse, which leads to more of the peasant unrest, and you can just see it becomes a vicious cycle. Another thing that was going on at the same time is a war between China and kind of the West, dealing with the drug opium. Opium, of course, is comes from the opium poppy, which then is derived into a number of different drugs. Opium was smoked at this time. It also is the main drug for heroin. And this was a valued commodity back in this time, in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And the British wanted to profit by trading in opium. They wanted to take opium and trade it to the Chinese, buy it from China, trade it to different parts of Southeast Asia. And we see that an increasing level of addiction leads to an imbalance of trade. So the addiction, the desire to have it, makes it worth more money, as we can see in kind of the drug wars in the United States today. And all of a sudden, China is losing that trade battle with Britain. The Chinese, seeing what this is doing to their society, demand that the British stop trading opium. But the British respond by bringing in the army and beginning what's called the Opium War in the early to mid 1800s. The British victory in the Opium War not only allows them to be transporting opium in and out of China, but also opens up China to trade with the West under conditions that we've never seen before. At that same point, we also have a rebellion going on in China, and this is more Chinese fighting Chinese. It's almost a civil war type thing called the Taiping Rebellion. And we have internal dissatisfaction, so unhappiness with the government leads to the peasants, as we talked about before, that are upset, uprising in the Taiping Rebellion of 1850 to 1864. The rebel leaders really want social and land reforms. They want to break down the emperor system, the empire system, and lead to also land reforms so peasants can have more control of the land that they farm. It's also a call for a return to traditional values. People want to get back to the Chinese values and cultures. They start to get upset with the Western influence and want to go back to the way things were earlier on. The Chinese government, however, which is under pressure, elicits or asks for Western help, and they crush the rebels in 1864. But this also ties the Chinese government back to the Western societies. That leads to what's called the open door policy. As the Qing Empire is weakening, the nations of Britain, specifically, and the United States, worry about their ability to trade in China. They have kind of owned the trade with China up to this point, and they want to make sure that they continue to have that level of influence. And so to avoid any kind of trade wars or even open war, military war, the U.S. proposes what's called an open door policy. So all Western nations have an opportunity to trade freely with China. Now, this is wonderful if you're a Western nation and a trader. It's not good if you're a Chinese individual. And this actually leads to something called the Boxer Rebellion. And this is back to that term we talked about at the very beginning of the lesson. The Boxers in China were members of a secret Chinese society that really were trying to push towards or a desire to go back to traditional Chinese values. They're upset at the amount of influence that foreign nations, specifically European nations, the United States, have in China, and they want to go back to the way things were before. So they actually attack and violently attempt to overthrow any kind of foreign influence in China. And this happens in 1900. There are a number of deaths. But Allied forces from all over Europe and Asia come to the aid of the Europeans that are in China and put down the rebellion in 1900. But because of this internal dissent, we really see the ultimate demise or fall of the Qing dynasty. And the Boxer Rebellion is kind of that last nail in the coffin. The Qing dynasty leaders still try to do one last kind of effort at reform, but the Chinese peasants are already beyond the point of wanting to try to work with this dynasty and are upset. And so we have a peasant leader named Sun Yat-sen who unites some of the groups in China and forms a nationalist party that is in opposition to the Qing dynasty. And this leads to a revolution in 1911, and the Qing dynasty ends at that point. The Revolutionary Alliance begins its rule in China with Sun Yat-sen as one of its main leaders. But then we see a civil war. Another individual, somebody associated initially with the old government, Shigai is his name, General Yuan Shigai, leads a revolution after 1911. And he is not well liked, and this leads to a number of different individuals being upset with his rule, and China eventually slips into civil war. After that point, we see a transition in society happening in China as well. The Chinese economy is rapidly changing due to all the trade, influence with the West, industrialization that's going on, and population growth. So we're seeing a lot of change in the society of China. We're also seeing Westerners becoming important, and Western art becomes popular in China. And we're seeing China begin to modernize and moving away from kind of a peasant or land or farming-based to more of an industrialized-based nation that we see today. So that's a little bit about China and its decline. Obviously, it picks back up again and becomes a world power in the days leading up to the modern day. But at this point, we're really seeing a slip in the Chinese influence.